thank you everybody for inviting me. So Matt and I talk a lot, so there'll be a lot of similarities, and hopefully I'm going to build upon some of the points that he's talking about. So today I'm going to talk about two concepts that seem like they have nothing to do with one another, but I'm going to bring together, and a lot of the other presenters have highlighted this, which has been great, is there's more to an athlete than just the data that they produce. And the reasons why they produce that data aren't always just physiological. And so the psychology, the culture around which, and the way in which we speak to that athlete influences the way they manifest that information and then actually create a movement from that. And so I'm going to talk to you both about belief and variability. So continuing on from where Matt was. All right, so I think I wanted to get everybody to be a little interactive, and this is really dangerous to do, particularly with athletes. But if you want to, assess your ability to see movement and understand it, we're all professionals in this room, I'd like you to just go to this web address on your phone right now. So it's polev.com and then /.soap. And we're just going to take a little bit of a test, which this should be active right now. And so it's really simple. I didn't want anybody to be biased. So I made sure that all you're looking at here is two people squatting. And I want you to choose the person you believe is a female. So you have person A, person B. One of those people is female. One of those people is male. It's not that kind of trick. So just watching. So obviously these are what are called light point diagrams. You get them oftentimes when you're looking at Vicon. So pick the person you believe is female. Just let a couple more people pull in. Some of you are messing with the polling now, and you think that this is like a vote, and you're like, well, let's make it a little bit closer. We are near, a betting town. I don't want it to be a total blowout. All right, I think we have the gist, so to speak. All right, so thank you, 24, 30, 35-ish people. People are changing their minds. I should stop the poll. And so most of you chose person A. So does anybody here want to volunteer why you chose person A as the female? Yes.
Right knee tends to dog us in, and the dog is supposedly more predominantly seen in movement.
Okay, and just for the opposites, so how many people, does anybody want to tell me why you chose B?
For me, it looks like it's a little bit of a shoulder shift or upper torso shifting on it, so maybe less stuff about an ass.
Cool. That couldn't have worked any better than I could have planned, so thank you. So both of these people made acute observations based on things that maybe they've seen in their past, right? And neither one of those people are right or wrong for that observation. I have a strong bias into why I'm glad that you said, apparently, thank you for predicating that, women tend to have valgus, and that's probably why they're at risk of tearing their ACL at every step of their life, which is how you perceive the risk of an ACL tear based on what we hear in media and based on what we hear even just reading textbooks, or actually, even worse for me, when you read the conclusions of research articles. But the irony in this is actually these are two random people, and person B was actually the female. Wow, they can squat. Miraculous. But what most of us know is that when you're working with an athlete, except for considering aspects related to the menstrual cycle, knowing the gender of that athlete tells you probably little to nothing about that person's capability, movement, and risk. We go to how do they move, and can I improve, and what are the other factors that are contributing to that person's risk and movement. But we all have this bias, and it's carried on us. And whether we like it or not, that changes what we look at all the time, and therefore confirming our bias with the justification and the observations we make for why something happens. Well, that's just an example why it's advantageous to take lots of different perspectives. I think it's just the room.
It's just the room.
Yeah. The next thing that you can think about is You know, when we're looking at a moving picture of dominoes like this, we know that this is a chain reaction. There's causes and effects. It goes in an order. The thing about it is movement's just like that too. There's cause and effect. But we have a bit of a bias in science sometimes. And that's we'll take a snapshot of maybe just a standing domino, and we'll say, hey, look at that domino, it's perfectly stable. But if we took this whole picture in context, we would realize that is a stable point until the domino prior hit it. So the reason the domino fell wasn't because it wasn't stable in that instant, it was because that domino was affected by something that happened prior, which is a domino knocking it back. But by the ways in which we analyze a lot of our data, we don't consider movement, which we look at all the time, which is a time series. We take one instance in time and we'll try to explain a lot of things. And so one of the things that I just like to give a really good example of is a lot of us are interested in sprinting. Sprinting, running, jogging all occurs in most of the sports that we're probably working with, except for math. And we, of course, have heard a lot about horizontal force, just remembering that's a computated vector and it's not real. We only have a resultant force, but it looks good in graphs, so we like to put it out there. And then you have the vertical force. And when someone's actually really proficient at sprinting, some of you may have read the research, we get an asymmetrical force curve. And that's super advantageous. Many of you are also familiar with the concept that the reason that's advantageous is it's what we're doing is we're loading a spring. This is movement at its finest. We initially brake to load the spring, and in the first about 30 milliseconds, we load the entire system spring, and then the leg reorients, and it's starting to be behind us, and now it's in a new position, and in theory, the purpose of loading a spring is to release a spring. But we analyze a lot of things and say and talk about horizontal force as if it's an entity on its own, as if it's not directly a cause from, or as if it's not caused by something that happens prior. So you say slinky, we have a spring load, it redirects, and then it releases that spring effect. So a really neat thing is if you look at the data differently instead of cross-sectionally, which is what movement's all about, if we do something called cross-correlation, where we delay time, that's what loading a spring is, by what biological systems from a turkey to a person have looked at for years and years and years, we realize when we take a delay of what was loaded in the vertical, it correlates depending on the efficacy of your stiffness, your pre-activation, from 0.869 to 0.944. I don't know about you guys, but if you know anything about correlations, you'd be ecstatic if that was your correlation for anything. And what that says is because we've been looking at things as if they're a single entity, we fail to recognize there's a cause and there's a subsequent effect. Even though we actually know and believe, and most of us coach and talk about these processes that should be fundamental to our hypotheses and interpretations of the data. But we get caught up in the data, which is why the real title of my talk should probably be something else. And this is the difference between most coaches have always understood the piston effect, the reason why you are trying to attack the ground. And then that allows you to redirect, and then you push off and you continue. That coaching's always been seen. But the scientists always seem to know as well, and they have this data. But if they don't interact in the way I just said, there's risk for either to misinterpret that. And that's something that actually came through as well with Matt's talk. So if I would have started this talk with bias, belief, and variability, many of you would probably have answered the movement question differently because you knew I was trying to lure you into a bias trap. So that immediately shows you how the things I say and what you believe influences your behavior. And behavior for us is movement. And movement has a lot of variability, hopefully. So in order to do that, we have to realize some of those aspects and how our bias, our language, what we say, what we deem, what we place, the culture puts onto an athlete, and how that actually intimately interacts with that person to change how their motor learning response occurs. This is a recent editorial that will come out, and it's interesting. and I'm a sports scientist, so it's pretty damning of our entire nature, and I wanted this. It's like a headline, Exercise in Sports Science, Failing by Design and Understanding Female Athletes. If you read a majority of the literature, it could be ACL risk-based, but a lot of literature where they do male to female comparison, I guarantee you in the conclusion, a lot of it says something to the effect of, and therefore females are different. Or because they were female, there was increased valgus. Or because they were female, there was a higher risk of an ACL. What's that tell me? Nothing. It's nothing changeable. And in fact, what I said before, and many of you nodded your head, knowing an athlete is female tells me little to nothing, except for I should also monitor their menstrual cycle, as far as what was actually causing them to have those risks. And if we change our mentality, and we've done this in research designs, if you take a strength-matched approach, or you take an approach where they're actually motor skill matched, a lot of the things that are innately deemed to be female actually wash out nearly 100% in the literature. But it's easy to make that kind of comparison. And that doesn't seem like a big deal, because all of you in here probably already knew that, and you believe that, particularly those of you that have dealt with elite athletes before. You're never thinking that kind of darn to tear the ACL just strolling down the street, that risk factor that we believe in the media. But see, the conclusions of those articles get caught up in the media and translated and fed, and it creates an environment, and it removes the belief from our athletes from the weakest of age that they actually can fundamentally change their motor skill, because they're destined to some kind of environment. And you know, that sounds like something that I'm just hung up on, but the motor learning literature is clear that your belief intimately interacts with an increase or decrease in skilled learning. So if we're creating an environment and we're not using our language correctly, we're actually changing the ability for that athlete to improve their motor skill. But the other way can go, and someone mentioned whether it's right or wrong to lie to an athlete, as long as they believe in something, it can also improve their motor skill. Because the belief that they have control of their system actually unlocks the ability for them to change the system. However, we can push them in the wrong direction from lying to them. And that can also mean something else.